Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, Yale, Harvard. These are not just names. They are the pillars of American civilization. They are the brands of power, prestige, and untarnished success, or so you have been led to believe. But what if I told you that the foundation of this American aristocracy is not innovation, not industry, and certainly not honor? What if the bedrock of these dynasties is something far more sinister? Imagine a wealth so vast it could buy presidencies, build Ivy League universities, and rewrite history itself. Now, imagine that every single dollar of that fortune was soaked in the misery of addiction. We are talking about the industrial-scale trafficking of hard drugs. Opium. Thousands of tons of it. Flooding an entire nation, enslaving millions of souls, and generating profit margins of 400%. And then, the perpetrators spent the next 2 centuries burying the evidence, sanitizing the history books, and ensuring that you, the average citizen, would never connect their illustrious names with their criminal origins. Until today. Because the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep the money tries to bury it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man chiseled onto Mount Rushmore, the savior of the Great Depression, an American icon, yet the silver spoon in his mouth was forged in the opium dens of Canton. His family fortune, the very capital that launched his political career, was built on the backs of millions of Chinese addicts. And he was not alone. The Astors, once the wealthiest family in America, drug money, the Forbes publishing empire, built on opium profits. The secret societies of Yale, funded by international drug smuggling. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history that has been systematically erased. We are about to peel back the curtain on the greatest cover-up in American financial history. This is the story of how America's elite families made their fortunes doing exactly what we imprison people for today, but on a scale that makes modern cartels look like amateurs. They poisoned a civilization, destroyed an economy, and walked away as American royalty. Before we dive into the dark secrets of these families, if you value the truth and want to uncover the hidden history that shapes our world, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell right now. Don't let the algorithm hide this story. Like this video to help us spread the truth, and comment below, "I want the truth." Let's begin. Let's start with the man who defines American leadership, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd president, the hero of World War II. We are taught to revere him, but the textbooks conveniently leave out the origin story of his privilege. FDR didn't just come from money, he came from drug money. His maternal grandfather, Warren Delano II, was a titan of the opium trade. While Americans were being told stories of hard work and enterprise, Warren Delano was in China, orchestrating one of the most devastating drug trafficking operations in human history. Millions of Chinese lives were ruined, families torn apart, bodies wasted away by addiction, and in return, the Delano family vaults overflowed with silver. That blood money paid for FDR's private tutors. It paid for his Harvard education. It bought the influence that paved his road to the White House. But the Roosevelts were merely one player in a crowded field of aristocratic drug dealers. Take the Astors. John Jacob Astor is celebrated as a fur trader and real estate genius. The Waldorf Astoria stands as a monument to his legacy. But furs were just the cover story. The real engine of the Astor wealth was opium. His ships didn't just carry pelts. They carried thousands of pounds of Turkish opium to China, trading poison for silver, then using that silver to buy the tea and silk that polite society consumed in their drawing rooms. And then there is the Forbes family. Yes, the same name associated with the magazine that ranks the world's billionaires today. Their dynasty didn't start with publishing. It started on the high seas, running drugs alongside the Delanos. The Perkins family, the Cabots, the Russells, the very names that sound like the heartbeat of old money Boston and New York, were all deep in the trade. By the 1832, American families weren't just participating, they were dominating sectors of the trade, controlling 10% of all opium flowing into China. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in modern value. They got so rich they didn't just build mansions, they built institutions. They founded universities to educate their children and museums to house their art, effectively laundering their reputations along with their money. But here is the most staggering hypocrisy of all. The very families that amassed unimaginable wealth by selling addictive drugs to the Chinese later became the moral crusaders of the 20th century. The Roosevelts, the Astors, the elite of the Northeast, these same lineages spent the next 100 years criminalizing drug use for the common man. They passed laws, built prisons, and waged a war on drugs at home, all while sitting on mountains of gold inherited from the world's largest drug cartel. This is the story of the opium aristocracy. It is a story of greed, power, and the ultimate hypocrisy. But to understand how they got away with it, we first need to understand the mechanism of the crime itself. What exactly was the opium trade, and why was it the perfect engine for building American dynasties? In the early 19th century, the global economy was imbalanced. The West, specifically Britain and America, was addicted to Chinese goods: tea, silk, porcelain. The demand was insatiable. But China? China didn't want anything the West produced. They were self-sufficient. They demanded payment in silver. This was a disaster for Western economies. Their treasuries were being drained. They needed a product, any product, that the Chinese would buy in massive quantities. They found it in the poppy fields of India and Turkey: opium. It was the perfect product. It was addictive. It created its own demand. Once a customer started, they couldn't stop. The British East India Company industrialized the production, but the trade was illegal in China. The Chinese emperor knew it was poison. He banned it. Smuggling it carried the death penalty. But for the Western traders, the laws of China meant nothing compared to the laws of profit. The profit margins were astronomical. You could buy a chest of opium in India for $100 and sell it on the Chinese coast for $500 or $600. That is a 500% return on investment. There was no legitimate business on earth that could compete with those numbers. It was high risk, but infinite reward. And American families saw an opening. American ships, the famous clippers, were built for one thing: speed. They were faster than the British merchant vessels, and certainly faster than the clumsy Chinese patrol boats. They were the perfect smuggling vehicles. American captains would load up in Turkey or India, race across the ocean, and anchor off the coast of China at secret rendezvous points. They never technically entered the ports, maintaining a facade of legality while offloading tons of narcotics into small Chinese smuggling boats under the cover of darkness. This was not a few rogue sailors. This was a systematic, corporate enterprise run by the most respectable men in Boston and New York. And the silver they extracted from the veins of China flowed back across the Pacific, washing up on the shores of New England to build the America we know today. Let's dismantle the myths, family by family. We start with the lineage that defines American political royalty: the Delanos. Before Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the face of American hope, his grandfather, Warren Delano II, was the face of American opportunism in its darkest form. Born in Massachusetts in 1809, Warren didn't just stumble into the trade. He sought it out. At the tender age of 24, he was already a senior partner at Russell and Company, remember that name, because they were the Amazon of the 19th century drug trade. They didn't just dabble, they dominated. Warren Delano spent over a decade in Canton, the epicenter of the opium flow. He wasn't a passive investor, he was the chief of operations. He directed the clipper ships, managed the bribes to local officials, and oversaw the distribution of thousands of chests of opium. When he returned to America, he didn't come back with just stories. He came back with a fortune so vast, it insulated his family for generations. He built a 40-room mansion in New York called Algonac, a palace built literally on the destruction of Chinese society. But here is where the story turns from history to a masterclass in hypocrisy. When Warren lost a portion of his wealth in the financial panic of 1857, what did he do? He didn't tighten his belt. He didn't invest in American factories. He went straight back to China to sell more opium. He rebuilt his empire a second time with drug money. That specific fortune laundered through time, and respectability is what paid for FDR's charmed life. Think about the irony. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who signed some of the first major federal laws criminalizing drug use in the United States, the man who stood for law and order, owed his very existence in the elite class to a grandfather who was, by modern definitions, a cartel kingpin. The Roosevelts didn't just have skeletons in their closet. They had an entire graveyard funded by the poppy. But if the Delanos were the political face of this dark history, the Astors were its financial titans. John Jacob Astor. The name is synonymous with New York City, the Waldorf Astoria, the New York Public Library. We are told he was a fur trader, a visionary who saw the value of Manhattan real estate before anyone else. That is the sanitized, Disney-fied version of history. The reality is much colder. Astor was a ruthless businessman who realized that furs were good, but drugs were better. His ship, the Macedonian, was legendary not for carrying beaver pelts, but for its secret cargo. Astor orchestrated a triangle of trade that was pure genius and pure evil. He bought opium in Turkey cheaper than the British Indian opium, shipped it to China, exchanged it for silver, and then used that silver to buy the luxury goods he sold in New York. The opium was the fuel for the entire machine. Without the drug profits, the Astor real estate empire might never have existed. By 1840, Astor was worth $20 million. In today's economy, that is $500 million. He was the first American multimillionaire, and while his descendants drowned on the Titanic as the world's richest passengers, and while his name was carved into the stone of America's greatest institutions, the origin of that wealth, the Turkish opium smuggled into Canton, was quietly erased from the narrative. And then, there is the Forbes family. Today, the name Forbes screams capitalism, success, and the global billionaire list. But John Murray Forbes and his brother Robert Bennett Forbes didn't start out publishing magazines. They started out as captains of opium clippers. They worked for the same Russell and Company that made the Delanos rich. These men were celebrated in Boston as great philanthropists and industrial pioneers. They took their blood money and poured it into the backbone of America, railroads. This is the pattern you need to see. This wasn't just money sitting in a vault. This was the capital that built the American Industrial Revolution. Drug money bought the steel for the railroads. Drug money built the textile mills of New England. Drug money founded the banks. The Forbes brothers are immortalized with statues and buildings, celebrated as men of vision. But their vision was focused through the haze of an opium pipe. They laundered their reputation so effectively that today, Forbes is the arbiter of legitimate business success, a devastating irony considering the illegitimacy of its foundation. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy belongs to the Perkins and the Russell families. These names might not be as globally famous as Roosevelt or Forbes today, but their impact is arguably more terrifying because they didn't just build fortunes. They built the secret power structures that run America to this day. Thomas Handesid Perkins, known as T. H. Perkins, was the merchant prince of Boston. He funded hospitals. He funded the Perkins School for the Blind. He was a saint in the eyes of New England society. But his sainthood was purchased with the souls of addicts. He ran opium from Smyrna to China for decades. He was the mentor to the younger traders, the godfather of the Boston opium mafia. And then there is Samuel Russell, the founder of Russell and Company. He was the heavy hitter, the man who organized the trade into a corporate machine. When he retired with his massive fortune to Connecticut, his influence didn't end. His cousin, William Huntington Russell, took that family wealth and prestige to Yale University. In 1832, using the social capital and financial freedom provided by the opium trade, William Huntington Russell co-founded a secret society. You know it as Skull and Bones. This is not fiction. This is documented fact. The Russell Trust Association, which funds Skull and Bones, was endowed with money made from smuggling opium. Think about what that means. Skull and Bones has produced 3 U.S. Presidents William Howard Taft, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. It has produced Supreme Court justices, CIA directors, and captains of industry. The most powerful, secretive network in American history, the breeding ground for the American elite, was literally incubated in the profits of the drug trade. When George H.W. Bush declared a war on drugs in the 1,980 seconds, was he aware that the secret society that tapped him, the very network that propelled his family to power, was funded by the 19th century equivalent of the Medellin cartel? The cognitive dissonance is staggering. But it wasn't just about making money. It was about what they did with the money when they came home. This wasn't a few rogues hiding their loot. This was a systematic laundering of reputation. They followed a specific playbook. Make the money in the dark, bring it to the light, build a library, donate to a university, and silence anyone who asks where it came from. They were the Cabots, the Lowes, the Peabodys. They are the Boston Brahmins, the old money that looks down on the new rich. Yet, their old money is dirtier than any modern hustler's cash. Abiel Abbott Lowe, for instance, ran clippers to China and made millions. His son, Seth Lowe, became the mayor of New York City and the president of Columbia University. The Lowe Memorial Library at Columbia, a centerpiece of Ivy League prestige, is a monument built on opium. This was not a small-scale smuggling operation. By the 1,830 seconds, the machinery of American opium trafficking was vast. We are talking about supply chains that spanned the globe. To understand the magnitude of this crime, you have to stop thinking about smuggling in the modern sense. This wasn't a few guys in a speedboat dodging the Coast Guard. This was the 19th century equivalent of Amazon. If Amazon delivered nothing but heroin. By the 1,830 seconds, the operation had become a logistical masterpiece of destruction. American firms like Russell and Company weren't just participating. They were innovating. They industrialized the delivery of misery. They used a specific unit of measurement, the chest. One chest held about 130 to 140 pounds of raw opium. It was heavy, sticky, and potent. And they didn't ship dozens. They shipped thousands. Year after relentless year. Imagine the visual. Sleek American clipper ships, the fastest vessels on the ocean, cutting through the waves with their hulls packed tight with thousands of pounds of concentrated addiction. These ships were the technological marvels of their day, designed for speed, to outrun the monsoon winds and the Chinese authorities. But their cargo was death. A single successful voyage could yield a 500% profit margin. In the business world, that is a unicorn. In the moral world, it is an abomination. But what did this business success look like on the receiving end? While the Forbes and Delano families were counting their silver in Boston mansions, China was rotting from the inside out. By the late 1832, an estimated 10 to 12 million Chinese citizens were addicted to opium. That is more than the entire population of many Western countries at the time. It wasn't just the poor. It was officials, soldiers, scholars. The drug hollowed out the workforce and paralyzed the government. It wasn't just a health crisis. It was an economic hemorrhage. For centuries, silver had flowed into China. Now, for the first time, silver was flowing out in a terrifying torrent to pay for the black mud. The Chinese economy began to collapse. The emperor saw his nation dying. He had to act. In 1839, the Chinese emperor appointed Lin Zexu with a mandate to end the trade at all costs. Lin was a man of integrity, a moral titan facing off against the greed of empires. He marched into Canton and did the unthinkable. He seized the opium. He surrounded the foreign factories, forced the traders to surrender their stock, and then, in a public display of sovereignty, he destroyed over 1,000 tons of British and American opium. He mixed it with lime and salt and washed it out to sea. It was an act of national defense, a desperate attempt to save his people. But in the eyes of the Western traders, it was an act of war, not a war for freedom, but a war for the right to sell drugs. The British response was immediate and brutal. They sent the Royal Navy to bombard the Chinese coast, triggering the First Opium War, 1839-1842. It was modern history's most shameful conflict, a technologically superior nation slaughtering a weaker one to force them to buy poison. And here is where the American story gets even darker. You might think, well, that was a British war. That is the lie. The Americans were not innocent bystanders. They were the ultimate opportunists. While the British ships were busy fighting the Chinese Navy, American firms like Russell and Company saw a golden opportunity. They stayed out of the fighting, but kept the business. Because the British were technically at war, they couldn't trade openly. So what did they do? They transferred their business to the Americans. The American traders, including the Delanos and the Forbes, effectively became the middlemen for the entire drug trade during the war. They flew the neutral American flag to sail past the combat zones carrying British opium to Chinese addicts. They profited from the chaos. They acted as the vultures of the conflict, feasting on the carcass of the Chinese economy while the British fired the cannons. When the war ended with the Treaty of Nanking, China was brought to its knees. They were forced to open 5 ports to trade, pay massive reparations in silver to the drug dealers, and cede Hong Kong to Britain. The treaty didn't explicitly legalize opium, but it castrated China's ability to stop it. The floodgates opened wide, and American firms were right there, ready to scale up. The Second Opium War, 1856-1860, followed the same script. China tried once more to resist. The West responded with overwhelming force, this time burning down the emperor's summer palace, a cultural atrocity equivalent to burning down the Louvre. The result? Opium was fully legalized. The drug trade was no longer smuggling, it was free trade. The human cost was catastrophic. Millions of families were destitute. Fathers sold their children to buy opium. The social fabric of one of the world's oldest civilizations was torn apart. But back in New England, the 1842 and 1852 were boom years. The profits from this carnage were being turned into the railroads that connected America. They were being turned into the textile mills of Massachusetts. They were being turned into the endowments of universities. The blood of China was being transmuted into the steel and stone of American progress. But the elite families knew the party wouldn't last forever. They were smart. They saw the writing on the wall. As the 19th century drew to a close, and as Chinese immigrants began bringing opium smoking to the United States, the narrative shifted. The very families that had flooded China with the drugs suddenly decided that drugs were bad. Why? Because they had already made their money. They had cashed out. Now, they wanted to protect their society from the very poison they had used to destroy another. It was a cynical pivot that laid the foundation for the modern war on drugs. This brings us to the most infuriating chapter of this saga, the Great American Pivot. By the dawn of the 20th century, the elite families, the Delanos, the Cabots, the Forbes, had fully extracted their wealth. The vaults were overflowing. The railroads were built, they had ascended to the highest echelons of society, and suddenly, in a twist of calculated cynicism, they decided that drugs were a scourge that must be eradicated. It wasn't a moral awakening. It was a strategic market exit and a consolidation of power. In the early 1900s, the United States led the global charge to ban opium. They spearheaded the Hague Opium Convention of 1912 and passed the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. America became the world's policeman on drugs. But ask yourself, why then? Why, after a century of state-sponsored trafficking, did the mood shift? The answer is simple. The elites had already made their money. They had cashed out. Furthermore, opium was no longer a tool to exploit China. It was becoming a domestic problem. Chinese immigrants, fleeing the very ruin caused by American opium, brought the habit to U.S. cities. Opium dens began opening in San Francisco and New York. The elites looked down from their mansions and saw a threat. They didn't want competition. They didn't want the American working class to become addicted like the Chinese coolies. And above all, they didn't want anyone pointing fingers at the source of their own dynasties. So, they flipped the script. They demonized the substance they had mass-marketed. They painted opium users, specifically Chinese users, as criminals and degenerates. They launched a racialized war on drugs to protect their own social standing. In the face of this hypocrisy, none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the 1,930 seconds, FDR signed some of the toughest drug laws in American history, expanding federal control over narcotics. The irony is suffocating. The man sitting in the Oval Office, whose entire privileged existence was funded by the addiction of millions, was now using the power of the state to imprison people for using drugs. He was the grandson of a kingpin, acting as the sheriff. While FDR was cementing his legacy as a hero, his family's past was being quietly buried under layers of concrete and marble. This leads us to the second crime, the Great Whitewash. The most successful aspect of this operation wasn't the smuggling, it was the erasure. How do you hide a crime of this magnitude? You don't hide the money. You transform it. You use the blood money to build things that are unimpeachable. You build libraries, you endow universities, you fund hospitals, you wrap yourself in the cloak of philanthropy until the public forgets you were ever a predator. Go to the FDR Presidential Library today, look for the exhibits on Warren Delano. You will find vague references to the China trade. You will see mentions of tea and silk. The opium is scrubbed. It is a footnote, a whisper, or entirely absent. It is historical gaslighting on a national scale. Look at the Astor legacy. The books tell you John Jacob Astor was a fur trader and a real estate mogul. They conveniently omit the critical years where opium profits provided the liquidity to buy half of Manhattan. Look at the Forbes family history. They celebrate their ancestors as captains of industry, masters of the railroad, pioneers of publishing. The thousands of chests of opium that capitalized those railroads? Gone. Erased. Even the Ivy League institutions themselves are complicit in this silence. Yale University lists Samuel Russell as a generous benefactor. It mentions his success in China. It does not mention that his success was built on the systematic poisoning of a population. Harvard's Cabot House honors a family whose wealth was steeped in the trade. They donated to these universities on the implicit condition that the narrative be controlled. They controlled the endowments, the boards of directors, and the history books. They ensured that their descendants, the modern-day senators, governors, and CEOs, would grow up believing their ancestors were noble merchants, not international drug lords. But the evidence cannot be completely destroyed. It lives in the dusty ledgers of shipping companies. It survives in the private letters where these men discussed bribe payments and opium prices with the cold calculation of modern cartel bosses, researchers like Daniel W. Delano and Eric J. Dolan have dug up the truth, but you won't find it in your high school history book. You won't find it on the plaque of the library named after them. The cognitive dissonance would be too much for America to handle. We are a nation that prides itself on freedom and morality. How do we reconcile that with the fact that our oldest money, our most respected institutions, and our greatest political dynasties are the direct beneficiaries of a criminal enterprise that makes the Medellin cartel look like a street gang? We compare this to the CIA crack cocaine scandals of the 80 seconds, where outrage was palpable. Yet, the opium trade was larger, longer, and more destructive. And the perpetrators didn't just get away with it, they became our heroes. They became the faces on our currency and the names on our street signs. We are living in the world they built. A world constructed on a foundation of lies and laundered money. And they are counting on your ignorance to keep their reputations intact. They are counting on you to look at the name Forbes or Roosevelt and feel respect, not disgust. But now you know. And once you see the pattern, make the money in the dark, buy respectability in the light, and outlaw the competition, you can never unsee it. Let's be crystal clear about the scale of this operation. We are not talking about a side hustle. We are talking about the foundation of American capitalism. Conservative estimates suggest that American firms extracted between $50 to $100 million from the China trade during the peak opium years. In the 1,840 seconds, that wasn't just wealth, that was empire-building money. Adjusted for inflation and purchasing power relative to the GDP of the time, we are looking at billions of dollars in today's value. But even that number doesn't capture the reality. That money didn't just sit in a vault. It was multiplied. It was invested in land that became downtown Manhattan. It was invested in railroads that became the Union Pacific. It was invested in banks that became the giants of Wall Street. The opium profits were the seed capital for the American century. To truly understand the horror of this, you have to apply a modern lens. Imagine if, right now, a group of American billionaires, the most famous names in tech and finance, were caught running a massive cartel that flooded Mexico with fentanyl. Imagine they employed thousands of people to smuggle the poison, bribed foreign officials, and lobbied Congress to keep it legal. Imagine millions died. And then, instead of going to prison, imagine these billionaires took their blood money and used it to endow Harvard, build the Smithsonian, and fund presidential campaigns. Imagine that 150 years from now, their descendants are celebrated as titans of industry, and their names are carved onto libraries where your children study history. And imagine that anyone who dares to bring up the fentanyl origin of their wealth is dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is exactly what happened with the opium families. We are the descendants living in the world they built, walking past buildings named after drug lords, and we are not supposed to ask questions. But there is one group of people who haven't forgotten: the Chinese. In China, the opium wars are not a footnote. They are a core component of national identity. They call it the century of humiliation. Every student in China learns about how the West, specifically Britain and America, deliberately poisoned their ancestors for profit. They know the names: Russell, Forbes, and Delano. They know that the wealth of the West was extracted from the veins of their people. This history explains the deep-seated distrust between East and West today. While America has whitewashed its crimes, the victims remember every detail. So, what do we do with this truth? First, we stop accepting the sanitized narrative. The Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Russell, Cabot, and Lowe families did not build their fortunes on trade. They built them on trafficking. They were not merchant princes. They were the architects of a genocide for profit. Second, we must acknowledge the staggering hypocrisy of the American elite. The same lineage that accumulated dynastic wealth by destroying a foreign population with drugs spent the entire 20th century imprisoning its own population for doing the exact same thing on a smaller scale. They used their wealth to insulate themselves from the consequences of their actions while enforcing the law on everyone else. And finally, we must question the institutions: Yale, Harvard, Columbia, the foundations, the museums, the political dynasties. They stand on a foundation of bones. The legitimacy of the American elite is built on a lie. The Roosevelts are still royalty. The Forbes name is still synonymous with money. The Skull and Bones Society still taps the future leaders of the free world. They got away with it. For 200 years, they have successfully erased the source of their power. But the pattern is clear. The elite operate by a different set of rules. They make their money in the shadows, where morality doesn't exist, and then they buy their way into the light, where they write the laws that govern you. This story of the opium aristocracy is just one chapter in a much larger book of hidden history. It is a pattern that repeats over and over again. From the tea clippers of Canton to the boardrooms of modern pharmaceuticals, the playbook remains the same: profit over people, power over principle, and silence over truth. But today, the silence ends. If this video opened your eyes to a history they tried to hide from you, you know what to do. Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning. We are going to dig up every buried secret, expose every hidden fortune, and decode the patterns that control our world. The elite rely on your ignorance. Do not give them that power. Share this video. Start the conversation, and join us next time as we decode the next pattern. They erase the truth. We are writing it back in.